Hey guys, welcome to night 2 of the Introduction to Web Development Mini Bootcamp at Lambda School. I'm Diandra Ryan Moss, your instructor, and tonight we're going to be learning more about HTML and CSS. So before I share my screen and we dive into that, I want to talk to you a little bit about Lambda School's main curriculum. I know a lot of you guys are here because you either want to attend Lambda School or are curious to learn more about it. So each night I'll go through and share a little bit more of my knowledge about what life actually looks like in Lambda School. So tonight I wanted to talk a little bit more about the admissions process. So if you guys do choose to go on to Lambda School, admissions is your next step. And as I say every night, if you have any deeper admissions questions or a special situation, just reach out to Karen Zachary. She is always the best person to talk to about all things admissions. So here's the basics of how it works. Our interview process is twofold. The first part is a code challenge, and the point of that is to just make sure that you're at a basic level that you need to be at to start Lambda School. And that code challenge is based around the JavaScript portion of this course. So all the topics covered in the Lambda challenge are going to be covered in this course starting tomorrow night and all through next week. So a good litmus test of if you're ready to take the Lambda challenge would be if you have gone through this course and you feel comfortable with each of the JavaScript homework sections. However, in some cases, people are prepared to take that challenge before they even finish this course. And if that's the case for you, we by all means encourage you to start the ball rolling on that right away. So if you have some previous JavaScript or programming knowledge, or if you're just an extremely fast learner, go ahead and reach out to Karen and get that process started. There's no reason to wait till the end of this course if you feel like you're ready. So as far as the next step, there is, as mentioned, a second part of the admissions process, and that is an interview. So don't worry about the interview. It's not a live coding interview. We're not going to make you whiteboard. We're not going to ask you about algorithms or anything like that. We just want to sit down and have a conversation with you about if Lambda is right for you. So as you guys know, Lambda School has this really cool de-risked education policy, which means that in most cases, you do not have to pay any tuition upfront. You can instead sign an income share agreement so that you're paying us back your tuition over the course of your first 2 years on the job. In other words, you only pay us back if and when you get hired. However, that means that we're really motivated to bring in people who are really motivated to get through Lambda School and get hired. We want to make sure that, one, you're committed to the hard work and time that Lambda School takes, that you're committed to learning, and that you're committed to this career path. And that, in general, you're the kind of person who can and wants to work with others and be cooperative. So a big part of this second interview is trying to make sure that you fully understand what you're getting yourself into, you're prepared for it, and you're going to help foster a productive learning environment for all the fellow students. So that is the admissions process. It's just those 2 steps. If you guys are feeling ready to get started on that, definitely reach out to Karen in Slack. So as a reminder of what comes after that, Lambda School is a 6-month full-time, entirely online web development and computer science immersive. So for 6 months of your life, you're selling your soul to computer programming. And then for the next 40 years or something after that as well. So you'll be attending Lambda School full-time. That doesn't mean we're going to be lecturing you Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 or anything like that. Our schedule is split up into a lot of different activities. So it's a combination of lectures, but with a lot of homework and project and group work time in there as well. So the good news is that means we allocate all the homework and programming time within the actual hours. I know some of you were asking last night about working concurrently with attending Lambda School. That's also allowed. We have an evening course available. So that runs at a slower pace and over the course of a year. And it is a challenge to go to work and then come home and learn to program. But for some of our students, that's what works best. So if you have any questions about start dates or which version of the program is right for you, once again, I would reach out to Karen. So that's all I have to say about admissions in Lambda School. Let's go ahead and switch our focus to our topic for tonight. So last night we started really at the beginning. We talked about what computer programming is, how one goes about thinking about solving a problem using computer code, and then we explored specifically one problem that we want to address as web developers, which is how to create a website. And the first step of that is learning HTML. HTML is going to be the language that will get your website off the ground. So tonight we'll build upon that with a little more HTML knowledge, and then we will switch our focus over to CSS. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and actually, before I share my screen, let's just start out with this little review. So we want to make sure we understand these two languages, HTML and CSS, and while we didn't look too much into how to write CSS, I talked a bit about the differences between the two. So can anyone in the chat window tell me what the differences are between HTML and CSS, what different tasks we might try to accomplish with both? I see HTML is what's on the page, CSS is style. HTML is a markup language. Interesting, because actually both of them are markup languages. So you are right, but it doesn't actually make it different. Oh, I like this. HTML is the skeleton of the page. CSS is the beauty. I think those are my perfect answers right there. HTML is the skeleton and CSS is the beauty. All right, it sounds like you guys have a pretty clear understanding of the both of them. So let me share my screen. We'll hop into CodePen, and then we can build upon the knowledge that we learned last night. So I know I just literally said we were going to hop into CodePen, but actually before we do that, I want to play a little bit more with this simple web page that I pulled up for you guys last night. All right, so let's check this out. And here's the code base for it. I should have already positioned these, so that's all right. Okay, so over here on the right, we have our code base that builds out this web page, and then on the left, we see the web page itself. And we can already see some examples of HTML and CSS just from the get-go. Things like the texts and even the box they're contained in are all going to be built with HTML, whereas CSS will actually style. So this is one of those subtle distinctions where HTML creates the container, but the reason that you can see the container, the border or the background, is made possible by CSS. So let's look at that in the code. Now that we have learned a little bit of HTML, what maybe looked like rather gibberishy last night, now should look a bit sensible. So there is some extra stuff on here because we're not in a sandbox environment, but starting below the body, we can see some familiar code. We start with a div box that contains everything. We have an H1 header at the top, a paragraph where some words are contained in the span. Over here, we can see that that span allows those to be invisible. Then we close out our paragraph. We can see each span is also being closed. Down here is a button, which is not an element we covered last night, but I bet you guys can extrapolate the rules of how to make a button from what we learned last night. So yes, down here we have our button as well, and that's just this button we see over here. And then we close out our div, and we also close out our body and HTML elements. So there you have it. That's how we created the web page using HTML. Now, one thing I mentioned last night is that an easy question, or a question that is easy to neglect, is the question of how does the code run? And when it comes to HTML, the code runs in a pretty simple way, at least in this example, which is that we open the HTML page in our web browser. And I've already done that for you, but you can see that up here, we're not actually at a URL on the internet. This is just a file location within the files locally stored on my computer. So I've literally opened the file and the HTML page renders. So let's go over and look at the CSS a little bit. And we'll talk more about this later in the night. But up here we have just totally different syntax that's building out this page. And we also have a totally different way of this code running. So we'll come back to the CSS a little later when we're ready to get into that. But I wanted to get you guys excited for the CSS learning we'll be doing later. So building on our knowledge of HTML from last night, let me get my CodePen set up, and then we can do a little review and learn a few other elements. Come on. Okay. All right. So the elements we learned last night, one of the first elements we learned was a div. And divs are one of the most critical building blocks of websites. In the example last night where I inspected the Lambda School homepage, and hopefully in your homework where you inspected some other web page, you probably saw that divs are everywhere. And they can be a little confusing to understand at first because by default they are invisible. That's because they're designed to hold other elements together. So if we wanted to create a header for night 1 of this class, and then we might have a paragraph where we said, we typed out what we talked about last night. So these two elements, this H3 and this P, this paragraph, are related to each other. So this would be a good opportunity to clump them in a div together because chances are we'll want to style them together. We might want to move them around the page together. So in those types of cases, it's good to store things together in a div. Now below we might create something similar for night 2. So this is what we'll be learning tonight. And we could even put a larger header at the top here if we wanted. And even though I said larger, remember, don't get too attached to, full stack web intro. Don't get too attached to thinking about an H1 as being large or an H3 as being medium, because we can always change those sizes in CSS. And in fact, we will be playing with changing those sizes in just about 20 minutes or so. So here you go. A little website kind of summarizing what we've learned last night and are learning tonight, and just built with these 3 types of elements. And then the final one that you learned last night was the span. Now, if we wanted to highlight the word HTML wherever it appeared in our code, we could always use a span to do that. Spans are also containers, but they're used for inline elements like this. So if you want to separate out something that exists within a paragraph or a larger bit of text, a span is the way to go. Now, because divs and spans are both invisible, it's kind of tough to see where they are. So I'll just throw in a little bit of CSS code just to make it slightly more clear. And don't worry about the CSS code. We'll be going over all of this in just a little bit. Okay. Let me do one more thing. All right. So now all of a sudden we can see where our divs are and see where our spans are. The divs have this black border around them, and the spans are highlighted in purple. So there you go, a little summary of what we learned last night. And just to remind you of the syntax of creating these elements, we always want to start with an opening tag, 2 brackets that contain the element name, and then we can put whatever content we want, and then close it off with a closing tag. Closing tags are almost exactly the same as opening, just with a slash put in them. It is important that we are precise here. We have to use the correct slash in the correct place, and the correct type of brackets, and the correct tag names. If you are ever curious or feeling forgetful about what exactly the correct tag name is, that's when you would want to do some Googling. And MDN is my recommended resource for basic lookup for this stuff. So over here I have the MDN page for HTML elements where every single element is listed out. So now that we've reviewed the elements we learned last night, I want to introduce you to a couple more elements that are maybe a little more complex. Okay, so let's create a new div box down here. I'm going to start out with showing you guys images. So create a little header. So the tag name for an image is IMG. And the first thing that makes images different is that it is what's called a self-closing tag. So in a few cases, you don't actually need the closing tag. You can put a slash at the end of the tag name, and it will close within one fell swoop. The basic reason for this is that some elements cannot contain anything. An image is one of those examples. An image is just an image. You couldn't put a header inside of an image or another div inside of an image or a paragraph inside an image. You don't really want to nest anything inside an image, which is why it's self-closing. So we've created our image tag, self-closing, yet there is no image on screen. So how are we going to put our actual image up? For that, we need an attribute. So an attribute is a new term that I'm introducing you to tonight, and it is important for a handful of HTML elements, including images. So attributes are also built into the language. So the attribute we want is called source. And once again, this is something that is built into HTML. So images require a source attribute. That means that it has to be spelled exactly SRC, and we couldn't use any other attribute name to get our image to work. And the source attribute is designed to help point to what source the image is coming from. So the syntax here is that we would do SRC equals quotes, and then we'll put the actual location of our image in here. In many cases, if you're working in a code base, for example, you'd probably want the image source to be a file location in your code base. If you're actually creating a production website, you want a hard copy of your image in your code base so that it's available immediately. But for using CodePen or for just making toy websites, it's fine to use an online image source, which is what we'll be doing. So up here, I have just this nice picture of this rusty old car. Notice that this is coming from a site called Pixum. Pixum is a really great site for just stock photos. So when you guys are playing around with this in the homework, Pixum's a good place to check if you're looking for some nice stock photos. So anyways, I have this Pixum photo and I want to make sure I grab the address for it. So be careful about just copying the URL from up here because sometimes this isn't actually the image. It might be the web page that the image lives on, and it won't work if you grab the URL in a lot of cases. So instead, right-click the image, and you can just see copy image address. That will guarantee you that you're getting the correct address for the image. And this is just the location online where the image is stored. So we can go back here and copy this over into our source, and then our image appears. So voila, we have now learned the image tag. Once again, the image tag is a little more challenging than the other tags we've seen for two reasons. The first is you have to remember that it's self-closing. And if you do a closing tag, it won't be the apocalypse, but get in the habit of actually self-closing the image tag, which is a slash at the end. The other piece is that it requires an attribute, SRC. So you just type out SRC equals, and then put the URL of the image in quotes. So make sure this is in quotes and make sure it's the actual address of the image. The best way to guarantee you're getting the address of the image is by right-clicking it and copying the address. So that's the image for you. One other neat thing that you now know how to do. The next thing I want to show you is a link. So let me create another div. What have I done wrong here? Oops, I forgot to copy the opening tag of my div. Let's try that again. And we're going to so let's say that we had a paragraph down here. I like that everything has to do with Lambda School, except there's like a random picture of a rusty truck here. But anyways, so if we have a little div box down here that says click here for the Lambda Schools, click here for the Lambda School website. So we want click here to actually be a link. So we are going to need an anchor tag. So then this is another confusing thing that's easy to mix up when you're just getting used to HTML. There is actually a link element, and this is totally confusing. The link element doesn't actually create a link. So it's more of a developer thing for linking in resources. And I'll show you a little example of that in a minute. But the link tag is not used for linking, like linking a website into your web page. I know it's confusing, but you'll get used to it in like to a week and then you'll never think about it again. So the link tag is actually called an anchor or an A. So let's go ahead and put an anchor tag around click here. And I might put this div at the top just so we don't have to keep scrolling down, because every time I change something, CodePen will reset. And okay. So yeah, so just like the span tag, links are designed to be put wherever. You know, you could even have an image that's a link, but oftentimes they're going to be a bit of text, sometimes within a larger chunk of text. So you can put these A tags inline just like the spans. So once we get this up and running, click here will be a link and the rest of it will just be text. But we can tell that this is not exactly a link yet. For once, if we click, nothing happens. For another, we've never told it where to go, so how could it possibly know? It turns out that links or anchors also require an attribute to work. And that attribute is called href. And this is another point of confusion. When you're first learning links and images, it's really easy to swap the two, to try to put a source in a link and an href in an image. It won't work. You need href with the A and source with the image. So here's a ridiculous device for remembering. Remember, href, there's like an A sound at the beginning. So put it with the A tag. All right, so once we have the href, we can actually link in our website. So if we wanted Lambda School's website, we could copy it over and plop it on in. So, and as I've showed you guys before, some elements have default styling. And links, of course, have this classic purple underlined circa late 90s style that goes with them. So it's easy to tell from the get-go that you have a link on your hands. And when we click on it, we are redirected. So I will say that links can be a little annoying within CodePen because as far as I know, there's no good way to get back to our code except just changing something and it'll reload and then putting it back. So one thing I like to do within CodePen that's also just useful to know is use the target attribute. So whereas href is a required attribute within anchor, the anchor will not work without it, target is optional. And you can use it by setting it equal to _blank. What that does is actually opens your page in a brand new window. It's a little more convenient in CodePen. I would recommend using the target blank inside of CodePen. It will just make life easier for you. So here's a little unofficial assignment for you. As I mentioned repeatedly last night, I want you guys to start to think like developers. And part of that means thinking in a new way when you're using the internet. So I already hope that you're starting to, whenever you pull up a new web page, to say, oh, hey, that's a header. Oh, there might be a div there. That's accomplished with JavaScript, that little color change. Or when I submitted my Instagram post, that was JavaScript. Another thing that you can just keep an eye out for is every time you click a link, notice if the page redirects or if it opens a brand new page. You now know what's going on behind the scenes when that happens. And as with everything else in programming, if you ever have any questions about what exactly the attributes are called, how exactly to syntactically write them, don't waste time typing different things and being like, is it href, is it r, pre, is it fref, what is it? Just Google it and you'll know instantly. It's really a waste of time. If you can't remember it off the bat, don't rack your brain. Just look it up every time you need it, and next thing you know, it'll be memorized and you won't have to look it up anymore. So that's how you create images and links. The last thing I want to show you guys is called a list, and it is a list. There are actually two different types of lists. And lists are kind of special because you actually need multiple elements to create them. There are a few things in HTML like tables and lists where you have to take different elements and use them as building blocks to create a whole. So let's, I'm gonna get rid of this image actually because it can create some lag time in here from reloading, and then I'll create a list. So let's throw this down here. So we're going to start, I said there are two different types of lists, ordered and unordered. So the first list I'm going to create is an unordered list. So let's say that we are baking some pie. I think I used the pie example in the last section. I'll stick with the pie example because I baked a pie a couple weeks ago, but it wasn't that great. So I kind of want to bake another pie, but this has nothing to do with programming. So let's do our pie example. So if we have pie, if we're trying to make a homemade pie crust, which, sorry, one more pedantic pie thing, make your own crust. If you're gonna, it's kind of a pain in the butt, but like if you're gonna put the time into making a pie, make your own crust. It really makes the difference. This public service announcement is brought to you by Diandra and Moss. All right, now back to programming. So pie crust. We want to create an unordered list for the pie crust ingredients. So let's actually say ingredients. So we start out with the UL element. UL stands for unordered list. And this will instantiate and complete our list. So every list related thing needs to go inside of here. Notice that the header isn't actually technically part of the list. They're related to each other, which is why we have them in a div, but it's just a separate element. And in here, we're going to need list items. So our most important ingredient, of course, is butter. The next one is flour. If I can type out things, I'm going to do some copying and pasting here. So we have butter, flour, we need salt, and finally we need ice cold water. So there are our pie crust ingredients. So every single item needs a brand new list item. And we see that by default, our unordered list is going to have bullet points. Don't get too attached to the bullet points though, they're pretty ugly, and one of your first steps will be removing them when you're actually creating a production website. So we have all of our ingredients bulleted out. So we had to use our UL element to start and finish our list, and then a brand new LI list item element for every single item on here. And I see someone is suggesting a graham cracker crust. I think I've made a graham cracker crust once or twice, but not enough to have the ingredients memorized. Presumably graham crackers are in there. Okay, so let's copy this over and we will create an ordered list. So an ordered list might be useful for the steps for making pie crust because that has to happen in a certain order. And I might gloss over a few things since the point here is to learn how to make lists, not to learn how to make pie, though pie is delicious. So the first step would be mix the flour and salts. Then we want to cut the butter in cubes and add to mixture. Then continue cutting in butter until about pea-sized, and then finally add water by the tablespoon until dough sticks together. And for the pie enthusiasts out there, this fourth step is the critical one. You don't want to get your dough too sticky or else it won't be flaky. So err on the side of flakier. You don't want a non-flaky pie crust. And on the subject of programming, we can see that our pie crust stepped ordered list has been created, except it's an unordered list because I forgot to change this because I was distracted by pie. So if we change our UL element to OL for ordered list, we see that the rules change a little bit. The most basic thing we can tell from the get-go is that we are using numbers instead of bullets. The LIs look exactly the same. They've kind of wrapped around because my steps are longer than my ingredients. But there they are. So use the OL to start and end your list. Use the LI elements to actually create the individual items on the list. Cool. So that's it for HTML. Those are all the HTML elements I want to show you guys. As I've mentioned and showed you, there are a lot more. I will say that some of these I've like never seen used. There's this thing, kind of an aside, but there's this thing in programming, in web development specifically, where you can't depreciate anything. So you can never remove something from the HTML language, for example, because you want to make sure that if you update HTML, you add stuff, but you don't want anyone's website to break. So some of these elements might be vestiges of time past, but a lot of them are used and a lot of them are useful. So you do not need to memorize all these, but once you're feeling comfortable with all the ones I've introduced, you're welcome to play around in here and explore some of these other elements. But the more important piece is that you understand the basic rules around it, how to create a tag, how to close a tag, and how sometimes we might structure the tags together to build something bigger, like a list, and how in some cases we actually need or can use these attributes to give important information to make our elements work correctly. So we're going to add some styling to this page. In the spirit of beginner CSS, we are going to be making this page look colorful in a completely awful way. So get ready for some ugly website making. But before we do that, I want to bring us back to this code base example for just a moment. So as I went over last night, there are a few steps you want to go through when you're trying to style a web page, or when you're trying to write any sort of program. And that is, first you ask, what problem am I trying to solve? If your problem is that you have this bare bones web page and you want to put some ridiculous colors on it or make it look really beautiful, then CSS is your language. The next step would be to understand how to use CSS, to understand the keywords and the syntax and how to structure out commands that will get the code to execute the style in the way that you, the developer, intends. So we'll be getting into that in just a minute and spending the rest of the class talking about how to actually use CSS to do what we need to do. Once you know how to write CSS and you've written out your program, you need to run it. Now, remember with HTML that you can just open the HTML file directly in the browser. That doesn't really work with CSS. Actually, let's just go ahead and try that. So if we try opening our styles.css page, it just displays the code. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it. A CSS page really doesn't stand on its own. It's meant to support an HTML page. So a CSS file on its own really doesn't work. And in the spirit of that, when we run our CSS code, we have to do it through our HTML page. And just as a heads up, this isn't something you need to know right now because our CodePen or our sandbox environment will take care of it for us. But I want you guys to understand what's actually going on and to be prepared to think about these things when you hop into using actual code bases in the main curriculum or if you're Googling around. So let's go over to HTML. Remember I said that the link element was not really like a user link? That's because it's the tool we use to link in style sheets. So we can see up at the top, there's something called the head, which we haven't really covered in this class. And once again, you won't need for this class. But this is where all the meta information goes. This is the behind the scenes part of HTML. And one of the critical things in the head is our link tag. So we link in our style sheet. There's also a style tag we can use up here to write style directly in. I don't recommend it. It's okay if you're just playing around, but you really want to keep those languages separate, so you might as well get used to that from the get-go. So make sure that your CSS is in a different file and you use the link tag to, and notice there's our friend href that links in that where our styles lives, and this will connect them. If we got rid of this, and actually a good moment to mention code comments, which you saw in the homework. Every language has a commenting syntax, which is just something you can add to a line or multiple lines, and it will tell the compiler, the computer, to ignore that line. It's really good for putting notes, or if you want to play around with what happens when I remove this code, comment it out. In the standard hotkey for that is Command/ or probably Control/ on a PC. So commenting out, really useful. All it means is that this line will be ignored. So if I save that and refresh my page, we can see the style is all gone. So that is how, this is the line where our style sheet, where our CSS code is actually being pulled in so that it is read by the browser. And if we put it back, the style appears. So moving back to CodePen, we don't have to worry about the head. We don't have to worry about the link tag. One of the nice things about the sandbox environment is this CSS section is auto-linked to HTML. So it's no sweat off our back, just whatever styling we write in here will automatically happen. So now it is time for us to actually start writing some CSS code. The CSS code, all CSS code takes this format. We can even see it over here, which is that there's some sort of tag name or something to that effect. There's some brackets, and then there are these pairs inside of here. That is the format of all CSS code. So let me teach you what each of those pieces are. The first thing we need is what's called a selector. The selector says, what do we want to style? So we can say, here's another code comment. We want to style all spans. So this, just writing the word span in CSS tells us we want to style all the spans. So then we use the curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets are what styles we want to apply to the span. So in this case, we want to apply a color style, and we want to set the color to purple. So the next line says, set the color to purple, and specifically the text color. And we can see that that has happened over here. The text color has been set to purple. This is called a property. This is a value. So the properties are all built into CSS. If we tried doing text color, it would break because text color doesn't exist. The thing that refers to text color is literally just called color. So once again, you don't have to memorize that. You can always look up the CSS reference, which I have up here. So here is a giant list of all the CSS properties you can use. Once again, you do not need to memorize these. Please do not waste your time and mental energy memorizing these. You'll learn the ones you use a lot really quickly, and the rest you can look up as you need them. Okay, so color is one attribute that or property that we might use. Another one that we really commonly use is background color. So we might set that to black. And now notice that our spans, the background color turns black. So the next command is saying, set the background color to black. And I'm going to stop commenting at this point because I think you guys get the pattern. You say what elements you want to style, and then you set the properties to a value. As far as what is legal for that value, it's going to depend on the property. So for example, all color related things, you can write out the primary colors. You can also, there's some flexibility of, colors like lavender are built in. And then if you want to get really specific with your color, you can always look up a color picker online. So if you just search hexadecimal color selector, you can pick any color you want. It'll give you a 6-digit or 6-digit /number code, and you can just put that code into your styling. If that's completely optional, if you want to do that in the homework tonight, I would just do a little Googling of the reference for color, and it will show you how to do that. So let's learn a few more properties, and I think our spans are ugly enough. Let's move on to our divs. So now I've selected all the divs on the page. And with those, I think I want to start playing with height and width. So I'm going to, to start, let's give them a background color. It'll allow us to see what's going on a little easier. And we'll do lavender. I keep spelling lavender wrong. So what's great about a background color or a border, I would actually highly recommend using either background colors or borders when you're first playing with this stuff, because it makes it a lot clearer where the element exists. So we might have assumed that our divs only went out this far, but it turns out that our divs actually extend the entire length of the screen. And there's really no way to know that unless we use CSS. I mean, we can inspect the page, but we can also use CSS to actually highlight where the full div exists. Also notice with this background color that it puts every single thing inside of the div with a purple or a lavender background. If I were to accept any elements that are overwritten. So everything inside the div has a purple background unless a different style says differently. So now that we have a background color, we can see height and width really clearly. So if we change the height to 200 pixels, all of a sudden these get a lot taller. We could also change the width to 300, and now they've just gotten more squat. So as with color, there are a few different options for what values you might use for something like height or width. For the purposes of your homework, hard coding in a pixel amount is a good way to go. You can also do a percentage, like let me just set width to 50%. There's another unit of measurement that's used in web styling called ems. You can look that up if you're curious. I will say though that this, while it's a good way to get used to how HTML or CSS works, this is not how we want to create a modern web page. Definitely not with hard coding a value in, and probably not with hard coding a width in. And the reason is that we live in a responsive era. So my web page needs to look good on my giant monitor, on my laptop, on my iPad, and on my cell phone. So if you hard code in a pixel amount and it looks great on your monitor, it's probably going to be unreadable on your cell phone. I'm sure you have all had that experience of clicking on a website on your phone and it's like words are being wrapped around and everything is a jumbled mess. That is a non-responsive page, and that means that someone didn't do their CSS homework correctly. So as far as creating responsive web pages, which is just to say that web pages that change their styling depending on the size of the screen, it requires a bit more of an advanced knowledge of CSS. So this is something we spend a lot of time on in the main curriculum. It is a critical skill to being a relevant CSS developer. It's maybe one of the most pertinent parts of writing CSS is making sure that your website is really nicely responsive. So we won't be worrying about that in this class. We just want to get you used to using these properties and values. It's always something you're welcome to explore on your own if you're curious to get a view into how to use it. If you are curious and you're feeling ahead, I would just search the box model. That's a good place to start for learning about responsiveness in CSS. But do not worry about learning it right now. I just wanted to get it on your radar as something that's important and that you will be learning in the future. So there's height and width and a few things you probably don't want to do in the long term, but are perfectly fine to do with your homework tonight. So another thing that we can play with is the border. So I'll put a border around, we'll just put a border around our div. So borders have a lot of different options for the types of values we can put in. Here's the documentation for border. We can just do a border style if we want, something like solid, dotted, dashed. We can also do a style and a color. We can also do a thickness and a style. We can also do a thickness and a style and a color. There are a bunch of different options. This is thickness, style, color. So what's cool about a border is that you can put multiple values in, and there's just a lot of flexibility in how you can work with borders. So don't get too overwhelmed with that. You can play around with it, but I would just recommend doing this model of thickness, style, color. That's a great place to default. So your thickness could be in pixels. Style, if you're lost, just go with solid, and color can be whatever color you want. We could also play with dashed if we wanted. About dotted. Dashed and dotted kind of look the same because it's so small. But there we go. So there's our border. Another really good way to get a better sense of how big our HTML elements really are. So border, one more thing I want to show you is, remember what I said about not getting too attached to this idea that H1s are large? Admittedly, you probably want your H1 to be fairly sizable since it's supposed to be something important, but if you wanted to make it tiny for some reason, you could always do font size. And all of a sudden, our H1 has just been deflated. So not recommended that we make our H1s or really anything on our screen quite this small, but a nice reminder that these default styles are not necessarily going to be our final style. We control that. And with font size isn't quite as important, but still important to responsive design. So, you know, this big old 40 pixel header that might look great on my monitor is going to be like all in your face if you're on a cell phone. So that's totally fine for the homework tonight, but you will be possibly exploring how to play with sizing in terms of responsive design as well. So the next couple attributes I want to show you, or properties, have to do with something that's called the box model. So oops, that's not where I want it to go. I want to go here. So the box model is just a nice little tool for how to think about how large your element is. And actually, I might hop back to that code base or that example I showed you at the beginning. So your element isn't necessarily just as far as the border goes or as far as the edge seems to go. There's a few different components. So your element really starts with what's called the margin. The margin is any space outside of it. So even though that space exists outside of the element, it's still also technically part of the element. The next thing is the border. We are pretty well sure what a border is. Within the border is what's called the padding. That's any space in between the border and the content. And then finally, we have the content within it. So in this very first example, if we inspect our div, we see that it actually highlights not just that box that appears to be our div, but everything outside of it. And it really clearly shows the box model too. We can see the orange is the margin, the space outside. We can see our border. There's that green chunk inside, which is the padding, and then within the padding is the content. So the content is where all text or inner elements are contained. So when we're thinking about how much space our element takes up, we have to keep all of these components in mind. And these things are also kind of the unsung heroes of CSS. It's easy not to think about margins or padding when you're just using a website. And if a website is well designed, you won't be thinking about them. As some of you might have noticed, one of the atrocious things, I mean, there are many atrocious things about the site I've created, but one of them is that these div boxes are all squeezed together and these borders look super awkward where they're kind of bleeding into each other. And we can fix that with margin. So let's go back to our div and add a margin of, let's say, 20 pixels. Now all of a sudden, our divs have been moved from the edge. There's some space between them. This looks a lot more readable. Another thing that's kind of awful about this site is that all the text is crammed up against the edge of the border. Really not readable, really not aesthetically pleasing. That would be the padding. So if we threw in even just 10 pixels of padding, all of a sudden this looks a lot nicer. So if you want just two elements to already take your website to the next level, padding and margin are a good way to go. They just add a nice little finishing touch in a couple lines of code. So those are all the properties I want to teach you tonight. As I have mentioned, there are many more. You are welcome to explore those, but I would recommend just getting used to these ones to start. And please use the references, especially with border. Border is really, I don't think I even had the order that these were supposed to go in memorized properly until I started teaching this class, because I was always like, oh, is it style or thickness first, color first? So make sure you use the references. They're there for you. All right. So this is all well and good, but it's a little clunky. So notice that when I select a span, I have to select every span. When I select a div, I have to select every single div. When I select an H1, there's only one, so it doesn't matter. But oftentimes we want a level of control and sophistication that really isn't possible if we have to style all elements together. Think about all the Lambda site and how there were like 3 different divs nested in each other. What if you wanted a border for one of them, but not for all of them? Based on what I've showed you so far, there's no way to do that, but that's because I haven't showed you how to do that yet. So let's say that we wanted to highlight everything in our pie step that has to do with butter. So we want to highlight the ingredient butter. We want to highlight the 2 steps that involve butter. So if we just did LI, and we want to set them to orange. So if we just did LI, color is, I don't know why I just typed blue. Color is orange. This will turn every single one of our ingredients to orange. So how could we just specify a few of these? And I see some people are already throwing out in the chat channel class and ID. So can anyone tell me, you're on the right track, we're going to talk about both. Can anyone tell me of classes and IDs, which one is the one we want for this problem? Class, class, everyone's saying class. Yay, it's a class. So there's something called a class, if you guys haven't noticed. It's what we're going to use to style a selection of specific items. So instead of styling our LI, we can style a class called butter. So whenever we want to style a class, we use a different selector. Instead of typing out the name of an element, we would type out a dot followed by our class name. So nothing has really happened here, and that's because we need to add the class into HTML. So let's go back and revisit our HTML page. You guys are going to be learning a couple more attributes, the class attribute and the ID attribute. So classes are used when you have a certain subset of elements that all belong to the same group. So for example, if we wanted a butter class, we could add class equals butter. I'm just going to copy this over. So the syntax is really similar to these other attributes. You start with the attribute name equals the name you want to give it in quotes. And this is something that you, as the developer, will come up with. So make sure it's something relevant, but unlike these elements that have to be precise, the class name can be anything you want. So, okay, so we have class butter. Let's go ahead and add it to these 2 list items as well. We scroll down, now we see that instead of styling all the list items, we've just styled the 3 that we specified. So we just gained a powerful new tool that's going to allow us to pick and choose what we want to style in a more specific way. All right, and then let's say that, and one thing I want to clarify about this too is that even though I've just put the class on LIs right now, there's nothing that says that classes need to be shared amongst items. So if we wanted to say that there's something particularly buttery about our lesson tonight, I guess that we're discussing butter, we could throw the butter class on our H3 as well. So now this specific H3 is orange, though this H3 is not, and this is not. Maybe it should be. Pie crust is pretty buttery. And these 3 items are all orange. So we can share styles amongst different types of elements using classes. Let's say that we just wanted, let me see what I want to do. I'll make background color equals, what do I want to do? Let's give it a yellow border. Okay, that looks pretty bad. So let's say that we wanted a yellow border around, maybe we wanted a yellow border around all of our butter elements. That's pretty simple. We just added it into the butter selector and we're good to go. But they look pretty bad on these, LIs. I mean, honestly, they look pretty bad in general. But what if we just wanted this to be on headers that had the butter class? We could do h3.butter. So now, instead of just selecting all H3s or all butter elements, we're getting even more specific. And in fact, this topic in CSS is called specificity. So h3.butter says we want elements that are H3s and have the butter class, which in this case is just one. But if we instead did li.butter, now it's only selecting the li elements that have the butter class. So maybe some styles we want to go to all butter elements, and other styles we want to go only to the butter elements that are also LIs. The syntax for that is, sorry about the scrolling, is going to be the element dot the class. Once again, if you are confused or forget exactly how to type this out, just search it and you'll be able to find code examples. So there's also another interesting thing going on when we add classes into the mix. So let me actually add just an li style. Maybe I want my li's to be blue. So notice that something happened. Actually, I'm going to open up the floor on this one. What just happened when I added the color blue to li's? What kind of weird, interesting thing is going on in this code? Someone said all li's turned blue. Notice that that actually didn't happen. So all the li's turned blue except the li's with the class. So in fact, and I think someone just said that the class overrode it, and that's exactly right. Another important piece of specificity is that there's a hierarchy in CSS. And this is really the crux of, there are two, I think, really challenging but important sides of learning CSS. The first one I mentioned, which is responsiveness. The second one is specificity. It's figuring out of all these competing classes and different attributes and different styles, which one is going to win. And it turns out that, as you guys have noticed, the class is higher priority. Classes will always override elements. So if there's a style that's coming from an element like this and a style that's coming from a class, that's going to override. What do you think will happen if I add a new color to li.butter? Who's going to win? Any suggestions from the crowd? If we have a color coming from just li, a color coming from .butter, if I add a new color down here, the last one. Okay, so let's do red. All right, so why? The reason is that the specificity rules say that basically there is a whole complex system of this that I don't really want to get into the weeds of, but essentially this has an extra point to it. So you can think about this as having 1 point, this one is having 10 points, and this one is having 11 points. So this is going to override. If for some reason you had two selectors of equal point value, the bottom one would win. So if I swapped the order, orange will win over red. And that's because CSS stands for cascading style sheets. It cascades. It reads from top to bottom. So if all else is equal, the bottom one will win, but there's all these specificity rules. So you can't count on the bottom one just showing up. All right, so those are classes for you. The next piece I want to show you is IDs, and a lot of you guys have already been mentioning IDs, and you're absolutely right that IDs will override it all. So if we have one single item on the page that we know we want to style, let's say that we want to style this, as I mentioned, this add water by tablespoon until dough sticks together is like the most critical step to creating pie dough. So maybe we want to clarify that. We might add let's add an ID called critical to it. And notice that IDs, unlike classes, instead of using the dot, you use the hashtag to select them. So these IDs can only be used on a single element. They only apply to one element, and they are going to be the highest priority. So for the critical elements, we probably want the color to be red. And maybe we even want the font size to be larger. Equals, let's say, 14 pixels. keep hitting caps lock tonight. Sorry, guys. So why hasn't this fourth item turned red yet? What am I missing? You haven't assigned the ID in the HTML. Yeah, you guys got it. So assigning the ID in the HTML looks almost exactly the same as assigning the class. You just use ID and you set it equal to critical. And we now see that, no, I guess 14 wasn't big enough. Let's try 18. Yeah, there it goes. So it's red and it's bigger. And we could, bold it. We could do all sorts of other crazy stuff to it if we wanted. So an ID, the difference between an ID and a class is, first of all, that classes can apply to multiple items. IDs are just for one single item. So it wouldn't make sense for us to say li #critical because there's only one critical. That doesn't give us any more information. The other difference is priority. This will overwrite. So if I added critical to one of the butter steps, it would overwrite the orange color. And I have a nifty little chart to help you guys remember. So tag selector, regular HTML syntax, you just write the tag name in CSS. It's going to be the third priority. Next, we have the class selector. You add a class, use a dot, second priority. Finally, we have the ID selector. There's an ID, hashtag in the CSS, first priority. You do not need to memorize this. It is very easy to look up online. So it's a relatively simple model at first step, but it gets crazy confusing because you can mix and match classes and tags, and you can even, there's all sorts of crazy things you can do with selectors. We've just scratched the surface with selectors. And to give you guys an idea of that, let me actually bring up our Lambda School site real quick. So I'm going to inspect again. We see in our, I want to drag this over. We see that there are some H1s here, but it turns out our inspector doesn't just share HTML knowledge with us. There's also some info about the CSS down here. So check this out. Here are all the stylings that have ended up on here. We can see a color, you can see a font size, there's a font weight, line height, white space, mostly things that you haven't learned about, but you can probably guess more or less what they do. But down below, these are all the styles that didn't make the cut. So we can see more things about margins and padding, but look at all these styles that are crossed out. This is really the best way to impress upon you guys how many conflicting styles are actually at work in a real web page. There are tons. There are tons of conflicting styles. So you'll have some homework assignments that'll help you practice exploring specificity in selectors, but keep in mind that it only gets worse. It can get really complex when you get into an actual production website. So let me go over the homework assignments for tonight, and then I will answer any questions and let you guys go. There are actually 3 assignments tonight in 3 different CodePen files. Remember, for every single one of these, you have to fork. You'll see your name appear down here. If it says append by your name, you forked correctly, and a save box will appear. So just fork and save. Those are your 2 steps. And CodePen will conveniently give you a little prompt reminder if you haven't saved for a while. So the first one is the selector quiz. It's all about the selector stuff. So there is CSS in here, but it has been commented out. Do not comment it back in. If you comment it back in, you will have the answers immediately. And the point of this is not to get the answers, it's to learn. So don't do it. You can do it at the end to check your work, but this homework assignment will be useless to you if you comment it out. So your job is instead to read this. So read the styles that are coming from here, look at the different IDs and classes over here, and then try and figure this out. So we have questions like, look at the element containing step 1. So this header. What is the text color? What is the background color? So you might go over here and say, okay, it's a H3, so I can see some info, but I better double check if there are any IDs or classes on it. So once you feel fairly confident that you got this, you can comment it out and check your work. And if you've gotten any questions wrong, just take a minute to try and understand where the error came from. The next assignment is also about selectors, but it involves a little more actual coding. So on this page, we've specified what each element should look like. This should be a red text with a blue border. This should have a black background and yellow text, etc. So you have to write your code in here to make the code match the styles. And it's a little harder than it looks because of specificity. We really highly recommend that you not add or delete any of these selectors. You could make life really easy by just adding your own IDs here. That's not the point of the exercise. Use the existing IDs and classes, use the existing selectors, and try to figure out how to mix and match to get it to work. It's kind of like a puzzle. It's kind of fun if you don't sweat it too much. And then finally, oh, and in this one, it'll be easy to check your work. Just make sure that each line actually looks the way it's supposed to. Finally, we have a free form assignment that's similar to your assignment from last night. So we want you to create a business web page. There are some HTML requirements, some CSS requirements, a stretch goal suggestion about things you could explore if you want an extra challenge. We've just started you with a few basic elements here. I always, when I read this assignment, I always read it in like Donald Trump's voice, like, very fantastic business. Our product is great. You should buy it. That was a terrible Donald Trump impression. It sounded better in my head, but this is my Donald Trump style website. Anyways, so, but yeah, so you can fill in the blanks, and not to make things political, but you can fill in the blanks here. You can start from scratch, whatever you want to do. Have fun with it. Come up with a ridiculous website idea. It'll be more fun. So those are the 3 assignments for tonight. So they're all in CodePen. Just remember to fork so that you can save. Yeah, very huge website. There we go. Okay, so that, oh, one more thing I just wanted to mention briefly about, I was gonna say earlier and forgot. You can add multiple classes. So if this is butter and, let's say we want to add a class to this that's called cubing. So syntactically, you don't create a brand new class attribute. You just separate different classes with a space. And now if I wanted to add some cubing style, let's just put a border around our cubing. Let's make a solid black border. Notice now that the element with the ID cubing, or the class cubing, I don't know what you would use cubing for in the real world. I'm just coming up with random things on the fly. But this all of a sudden has a black border around it. So the big takeaway here is elements can have multiple classes. They can have a class and an ID. And the syntax for multiple classes is you don't create a brand new class attribute. You just use a space in between them. Okay, that's not that important, but I just wanted to mention it. So we are all done with the lesson. I've showed you the homework. That means it is question time. Make sure you actually put the questions in the Q&A section. I try and keep an eye on chat, but I will see them a lot better if you submit them via Q&A in Zoom. You guys had so many questions last night, and now I'm not seeing anything. Oh, okay, is there a limit to the classes that can be added to a tag? Nope, no limit. You'll make your life, I mean, you'll see a lot of classes on production websites. I would use as few as you can to try and not make life too confusing, but there is no limit. Do we answer the homework questions in the JS section? So, in assignment 1, yes. Once again, this is just commented out. So you'll just, because it's just a answer response, you'll say, you know, color is blue, background color is yellow. I'm just making those colors up. That's probably not the right answer. So you can just type the answers in here. So that's the case for just assignment 1. Assignment 2, you actually write in the CSS, and you write CSS in. Assignment 3, you'll write your code both in the HTML and the CSS. So we try to make that as clear as possible in our comments within the assignments, but hopefully that cleared it up. Question, how do you know when to use margin and padding? Pretty much every element is going to have margin and padding. It's a good rule of thumb. But for starters, I would just say if it looks squished and weird, you might want to use margin and padding. Do we have to fill out daily attendance every night? The main attendance form was 1 night only. However, if you stick around for the homework section and the stand-up, they will send out a nightly stand-up form. So there will be a form going out every single night at around 7 o'clock. Okay, here's a good question. Why add more than 1 classes to a single tag or element? Let me show you why. Let me go back over here. So let's say that, let's actually use critical. Okay, so we already saw why we want to use butter in multiple places, because there are multiple elements that apply the butter class. Let's say that there are also a few elements on the page that we wanted to have that black border for. I'm just going to call this black border because cubing is a really weird class name. So if we wanted to just add black borders to things, and we want this to have black border, and we wanted this to have a black border, and maybe night 1 as well for whatever reason, class, not less. So now we were able to add black borders to the elements that needed black borders, and we were able to add this style yellow to the things that needed a yellow style or orange style. So really it's just different classes will be meant to capture different groups of styles. And sometimes an element might apply one style and another style from a different class. So it's just a way of making life easy. If we couldn't add multiple classes, we would need a brand new class or ID that says orange coloring and black border. Instead, we can have the black border in one space, the orange color in one space, and just add both classes to add both styles. So I hope that answered your question. Okay, how to assign padding in the vertical. So when we write, one thing I will say about margin and padding is that there is some default margin and padding in there. So everything isn't just by default completely squished together. So just keep an eye out for that. So let's look at, let's just look at our divs. So when I added padding in, it actually, and I'm gonna get rid of this height width thing because it's making life more difficult. So when let me just put my padding to 1 pixel. Notice that we lost space in every direction. There is some default padding here already, but if we added 30, that's 30 below, 30 above, 30 to the side. There is some extra margin in here from the elements, but we did actually add padding on all 4 sides. If we wanted to add padding just above, we could always do padding top, and it would just add padding to the top, or padding bottom, padding left, padding right. So padding and margin both cover all 4 sides, but it can be kind of confusing because there are some other just default margins and paddings in there. If we want to specifically add it to one side, there's a different property we can use for that. Okay, let's see. Can an ID be a div? So IDs and elements are totally different. You can't have an ID without an element. So you can have a div that has an ID on it. For example, we could do ID, call this first div, and maybe our first div gets an honorary blue background. Oops, not backface. Background color blue. So we just added an ID on top of our div. But if we tried to, for example, create an element like this, it wouldn't work. An ID is not the same as an element. So an ID and a div can work together, but you couldn't replace a div with an ID. How to clear the bullet of an unordered list. I've been asked this question before, and I always forget exactly what the attribute is called because my memory is terrible, but this is a great chance for Googling. So let's say remove bullet. I think it's just called list style in CSS or something like that. Yeah. Or list style type.
Yeah, it might be the latter.
Okay, I think it's list style type. If you guys haven't figured out already, the reason I'm such a fan of Googling is because I'm terrible at memorizing things. There we go. So we can always change list style type to square, circle, etc. Or we can just change it to, I think none is an option here. None. Ta-da. So let's go ahead and do that. And oh, this is an important piece, is that notice that the list style type goes on the UL or the OL. So you can't go in and just change it on one of the items. You have to change it on the entire list. So if we go in to our, I don't think I've actually selected our lists, but let's just select our, let's do our unordered list. List style type. I probably could have just done autocomplete and figured it out. And see, now it is gone. Okay, the difference between a class and ID. This is really critical. So the difference between a class and ID is twofold. The first is that classes can go on multiple items. If you have a class called Butter, you can make as many items as you want on your page buttery. If you had an ID called Butter, you could only make one item buttery. So you would have to, so IDs are good when you just have one outlier that needs a style. Classes are good when you have a reoccurring style that's going to be applied to a lot of different elements. And it also affects specificity. So any styling that's coming from an ID selector is going to be prioritized over any styling coming from a class selector. All right, so let's see. Sorry. Question about how to underline stuff. I'm trying to remember how to do that too. I think it's, let's Google that as well. CSS. As you guys might be able to tell, a lot of the work, and I mentioned this last night, a lot of the work I did on the field was data aggregation stuff that did not involve much CSS. So I do not have like all the CSS stuff memorized, but I think it's really good because we get to Google together. All right, text decoration, that's what it's called. So let's go ahead and do that too. What do you guys want to underline? Throw out some selectors. Salt? Okay, let's underline salt. So if we're just, here's a little quiz for you guys. If we're just underlining the list item salt, what selector do we need? Or how do we correctly select just that single element? Give it a class. Nothing's more classy than salt. So we'll give it a salty class. Or let's give it an ID actually, since it's just a single item. So hashtag salty. and text decoration, underline. Now our salt is underlined. Well, I feel like we could do this all night because there's a million different fun random things we could play around with doing. It seems like you guys have the basics down. I better make sure you have enough time for homework. So I'm gonna let you guys go. I'll just quickly answer the why the hashtag. The hashtag is necessary when you're using an ID selector. The dot is necessary when you're using a class selector. If I just selected salty, it'd be looking for an element called salty, which does not exist. So I better use the hashtag for an ID. Okay, that is all I have for you guys tonight. You've learned how to do a lot more cool stuff in HTML and learned a ton about CSS tonight, as well as some skills for how to keep learning how to do different fun stuff in CSS. One thing I will just say about CSS from the get-go, centering elements, not as easy as it sounds. Don't fall down that rabbit hole unless you're prepared for things to get a little weird. So watch out for centering things. It seems like it should be simple, and thanks to Flexbox, it's not too bad, but a little challenging. However, most things that you just think up, you're going to be able to do a quick Google search and see how to do them in CSS. So have fun with the selectors and the homework tonight, and I will see you guys tomorrow for some JavaScripting. I'll see you then. Oh, and as far as where to find the homework, there are links to all 3 assignments inside of Slack. Just look at the top of the Slack channel, and there's a little students, there are a bunch of relevant links there. If you have the syllabus, you can also find the links in the syllabus. All right, I'll see you guys tomorrow.